The call came during my father's funeral. I was standing beside Augustus Drexler's casket, watching them lower him into the ground, when my phone buzzed. An email from Celine Corwin in HR, subject line, immediate termination notice. I stared at the screen while dirt hit the wooden box below. 20 years with the company. 20 years building their entire DevOps infrastructure from nothing. And they fired me by email while I buried my dad. The message was cold, corporate speak. Position eliminated due to restructuring. Effective immediately. No warning. No meeting. Just a digital knife in the back while I said goodbye to the man who taught me everything about honor and hard work. Around me, family members whispered prayers and shared memories. My uncle spoke about Augustus's dedication to his students, how he'd mentored thousands over his 40-year career. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here was a man who'd built lasting relationships through integrity, being honored by people who genuinely mourned his loss. Meanwhile, the company I'd served faithfully for 2 decades couldn't even wait for his body to be in the ground before discarding me like office furniture. I slipped the phone back into my suit pocket and finished the prayer. But something had changed in those 60 seconds. The grief was still there, but it was joined by something else. Something quiet and dangerous. When I got back to the office Tuesday morning, my badge didn't work. Security had already been told. I had to wait in the lobby like a visitor while they called upstairs. The security guard, Martinez, wouldn't look me in the eye. We'd shared coffee breaks for 15 years, talked about his kids, his divorce, his dreams of early retirement. Now he treated me like a stranger. Marla Veyron came down herself, new COO with her sharp suit and sharper smile. She walked me to my desk under the eyes of my team. My nameplate was already gone. My computer had been wiped. 20 years of projects, innovations, and late-night fixes erased overnight. The desk drawers had been emptied. Even my emergency candy stash was gone, probably rifled through by security like I was some kind of criminal. My certifications, carefully framed and displayed, had been stacked in a corner like trash waiting for pickup. She handed me a box. "Clean out your personal items," she said loud enough for everyone to hear. "Orvin Crail will be taking over your responsibilities." Orvin stood behind her, grinning like he'd won the lottery. The guy couldn't code his way out of a paper bag, but he had Marla's ear. 6 months ago, I'd written his performance review, noting his fundamental misunderstanding of basic networking protocols. Now he was supposed to manage systems that had taken me 2 decades to perfect. My team watched in silence. Nobody said a word. Nobody stood up. They just stared as I packed my coffee mug and the photo of my dad into a cardboard box. Sarah from Systems Administration looked like she might cry, but she didn't speak. Tom from Network Security studied his shoes like they held the secrets of the universe. The texts started coming that evening. "Sorry, man, that's rough. Can't believe they did that. Hope you land on your feet." 20 years of mentoring people, covering for them, fighting for their raises and promotions. And all I got were sorry texts. Not one person called. Not one person said they'd quit in protest. They were all too scared for their own jobs, too comfortable in their cubicles to risk standing up for what was right. I understood it, but that didn't make it hurt less. I sat in my empty apartment, staring at the termination email on my laptop screen. The words blurred together as I read them for the 100th time. Position eliminated due to restructuring. What restructuring? They'd simply replaced me with an incompetent yes man who'd never questioned Marla's increasingly unrealistic promises to clients. My father had been a professor for 40 years. He taught me that loyalty meant something, that treating people right mattered, that your word was your bond. His students had spoken at the funeral about how he'd changed their lives, how his integrity had inspired them to be better people. The contrast with my corporate reality was stark and painful. Marla had just shown me what the corporate world really thought about those values. But she made one mistake. She thought firing me would make her problems disappear. She had no idea what kind of problems she just created for herself. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about something my father told me when I was 12. We were in his garden, pulling weeds from around his tomato plants. The summer sun was hot on our backs, and his hands were gentle but firm as he showed me how to get the roots without damaging the good plants. "Caius," he said, "if someone cuts you down, don't just grow back. Make them choke on the roots they left behind." At the time, I thought he was talking about bullies at school. Jimmy Torino had been giving me trouble, and I'd come home with a black eye and wounded pride. Now I understood what he really meant. Augustus wasn't just talking about resilience. He was talking about consequences, about making sure that those who wronged you understood the true cost of their actions. Marla thought she'd cut me clean, but she'd left my roots deep in every system they used. Every server configuration bore my signature. Every automated process followed logic I developed through years of trial and error. Every vendor relationship was built on trust I'd earned through competence and reliability. I'd built their entire technical foundation over 2 decades, and she'd just handed control to an incompetent fool who didn't even know what questions to ask. She wanted to play corporate games. Fine, but she was about to learn that some people build things that can't be replaced, and some people remember every single detail of what they built. The next morning, Celine called me into the HR office to discuss my severance package. The building felt different now that I was officially an outsider. Employees I'd worked with for years hurried past without making eye contact. The elevator ride to the 4th floor felt like ascending to my own execution. She sat behind her desk like a judge reading a sentence. 2 weeks' pay, standard non-compete clause, confidentiality agreement. The papers were already printed, waiting for my signature like a foregone conclusion. Sign here, she said, sliding the papers across the polished wood. This is generous considering the circumstances. Generous. 2 weeks' pay for 20 years of service. I'd seen janitors get better severance packages, but I read every line twice anyway, my lawyer's training from Augustus kicking in. He'd always told me to read everything, understand everything, and never sign blindly. The non-compete was weak. They'd written it to cover software development, but I wasn't planning to write code for anyone else. I was planning to consult, to advise, to share the knowledge I'd accumulated over 2 decades. The confidentiality clause only covered trade secrets, not public records or industry knowledge. And the severance was a joke. 2 weeks for 20 years. I need time to review this with a lawyer, I said. Celine's smile tightened. This offer expires at close of business Friday. I stood up without signing anything. Then I guess we'll see what Friday brings. Her face went pale. She knew they'd made this personal when it should have stayed professional. She knew they'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. That weekend, I did something I'd never done in 20 years. I logged into the admin systems remotely to check something. Not to sabotage anything. Not to steal data. Just to see if Marla had bothered to change the master passwords I'd set up years ago. She hadn't. The hubris was staggering. They'd fired the architect, but left him with keys to the building. Orvin was running the entire infrastructure with access I'd created, using protocols I'd designed, managing systems he didn't understand with credentials that still bore my digital fingerprints. It was like watching a toddler play with a loaded gun. Every automation script had my signature embedded in the comments. Every security protocol ran through frameworks I'd built from scratch, with logic that existed nowhere in their documentation. The monitoring systems, the backup procedures, the disaster recovery plans, all of it tied to processes that only existed in my head. I could see the signs already. Error rates are creeping up. Response times degrading. Small failures that would cascade into larger problems if not addressed quickly. The infrastructure was like a finely tuned engine that required constant maintenance from someone who understood its intricacies. Marla thought she'd eliminated a problem employee. She'd actually removed the keystone from an arch that was about to collapse. I logged out and made my first phone call. Time to remind some people what real expertise looked like. I drove to Augustus's grave that Sunday morning. The cemetery was quiet, morning mist rising from the grass. The headstone was simple, just his name and dates. No fancy quotes or religious symbols. That wasn't his style. He'd always believed that a man's life spoke for itself, that actions mattered more than words carved in stone. I knelt in the grass and spoke to him like he was still listening. They fired me while I buried you, Dad. Thought they could just throw me away like garbage. The wind picked up, rustling the oak leaves above his plot. The same oak tree where he'd taught me to identify different species when I was 8. He'd had a way of turning every moment into a lesson, every experience into wisdom. You always said some fights are worth having. This is one of them. I placed my hand on the cold granite, feeling the sharp edges of his carved name. Augustus Drexler, professor of philosophy, father, teacher, man of principle. I'm not just going to fight back. I'm going to bury them piece by piece, just like they tried to bury me. When I stood up, Something had crystallized in my mind. This wasn't about getting even anymore. This was about showing the world what happens when you betray loyalty and excellence. Marla wanted to play corporate warfare. She'd just picked a fight with someone who knew where all the bodies were buried. Monday morning, I called Dorian Hext. He ran the biggest cloud services vendor in our region, and we'd worked together for 15 years. His company, Pinnacle Solutions, provided the backbone for half our infrastructure. We'd built that relationship through late-night emergency calls, weekend deployments, and mutual respect for technical excellence. Caius, heard what happened, he said before I could even explain. Marla's an idiot. I got straight to the point. I'm starting a consultancy. Specialized DevOps for mid-sized companies. Are you interested in partnering? There was a pause. Then Dorian chuckled. You know how many clients have been asking for someone exactly like you? Someone who actually knows what they're doing instead of just talking about synergy and digital transformation. We set up a meeting for Wednesday. As I hung up, I realized something beautiful. Marla thought expertise was replaceable. She was about to learn that real relationships in this industry run deeper than corporate org charts. And I'd been building those relationships for 2 decades while she was still climbing the ladder by stepping on people. The phone rang again before I could set it down. Marcus Reed from Data Vault Systems. Another vendor, another 15-year relationship. Heard you're available, he said. Got any interest in some freelance architecture work? By Wednesday, Orvin was already drowning. My old teammates were sending me panicked texts. The automated backup system had failed over the weekend. The monitoring dashboard was throwing error codes nobody understood. 3 client servers had gone down, and Orvin spent 6 hours trying to fix what should have taken 20 minutes. Marla's losing her mind, one text read. She's blaming everyone except the guy she put in charge. Another message from Sarah. Orvin asked me to explain the database replication process. I told him you never documented it. He started yelling about proper procedures. I almost smiled at that. The database replication process was documented, but the documentation assumed knowledge that Orvin simply didn't possess. It was like giving someone sheet music without teaching them to read notes. I met Dorian at his downtown office. Tall building, corner office, view of the river where barges carried cargo to and from the industrial district. The same river I could see from North Point's headquarters, though from a much better angle. Your old company's been calling me all week, he said, pouring coffee from an expensive-looking machine. Orvin doesn't know the first thing about our service agreements. I sipped the coffee. It was good, expensive. Colombian, if I had to guess. What kind of calls? Panic calls. System failures they can't diagnose. They want emergency support at triple rates. Dorian leaned back in his leather chair. I told them my top engineer just went independent. Guess who I recommended? That afternoon, I got my first consulting call. Regional Medical Group, 40 servers, custom applications that kept crashing. Dr. Patricia Williams, their IT director, sounded exhausted. We've been with North Point Industries for 3 years, she explained. But their support has gone to hell lately. Systems failing, slow response times, and their new technical lead doesn't seem to understand our setup. Can you take a look? North Point Industries. Marla's company. I almost laughed. When do you need this fixed? Yesterday. We're losing patient data every time it goes down. That's people's medical histories, treatment plans, everything. We can't operate like this. I quoted them half what North Point charged and promised a solution within 48 hours. It took me 6 hours to fix what Orvin had been failing to address for 2 weeks. The issue was elegant in its simplicity. He'd changed a configuration setting without understanding its dependencies, creating a cascade failure that crashed the entire patient database system. The medical group was so impressed they offered me a 2-year exclusive contract. My first client, stolen directly from under Marla's nose. But this was just the beginning. I had a list of every company Marla thought she owned, and I was going to visit each one personally. Dr. Williams walked me to my car after the fix was complete. 20 years we've been looking for someone who actually understands our systems, she said. Where have you been hiding? Working for people who didn't appreciate what they had. I replied. Friday morning, Marla called me directly. Her assistant must have been desperate if she was making her own calls now. Her voice was tight, controlled, but I could hear the stress underneath like a violin string stretched too far. Caius, we need to talk. There seemed to be some issues with system transitions. I was sitting in my home office, looking at 3 new client contracts on my desk. The morning sun streamed through windows that overlooked the same neighborhood where I'd grown up, where Augustus had taught me to value substance over appearance. What kind of issues? Technical difficulties. Some processes aren't as documented as we thought. That was corporate speak for everything's on fire and we don't know how to put it out. I let the silence stretch. In negotiations, Augustus had taught me silence was a weapon. Let the other person fill the void with increasingly desperate offers. Finally, she continued, we'd like to offer you a consulting position. Temporary, to help with the transition. The audacity was breathtaking. They fired me for going to my father's funeral, and now they wanted to hire me back as a contractor to fix their mess. It was like burning down someone's house and then asking them to help rebuild it for minimum wage. What's your rate? I asked. We were thinking of your old salary, prorated hourly. I calculated quickly. My consulting rate is 4 times what you paid me as an employee, plus expenses. Minimum 40-hour commitment. The line went quiet. I could practically hear her mental calculator smoking. She didn't call back that day, or the next. But Orvin did, around midnight on Sunday. He was drunk, slurring his words, desperate. The background noise suggested he was calling from a bar, probably one of those sad places where middle management drowns their failures in cheap whiskey. Caius, man, I'm drowning here. The whole system's falling apart, and Marla's blaming me for everything. I let him talk. He rambled about error logs he couldn't read, client complaints he couldn't address, basic functions that had stopped working. His voice carried the particular desperation of someone who'd realized they were in over their head, but couldn't admit it publicly. She told everyone I was the expert now, that I could handle everything you used to do, but I don't know what half of this stuff does. The systems were designed to be elegant, efficient, and maintainable, but elegance requires understanding. Without someone who knew the underlying logic, they were slowly breaking down like a Swiss watch in the hands of someone who thought it was just another timepiece. You set up all these automated things, right? They're not working anymore. The backup systems keep failing, and I can't figure out why. I knew exactly what was happening. The systems were designed to be maintained, not just operated. Without regular updates and adjustments, they were slowly breaking down, like a garden nobody watered. I can't help you, Orvin, I said quietly. You have my job now. Figure it out. I hung up and poured myself a drink. Let him drown. By the 3rd week, word was spreading through the industry like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. Caius Drexler was available. The guy who'd built North Point's legendary infrastructure was taking on new clients. My phone started ringing constantly. Small companies who'd heard about my work through the vendor network. Mid-sized firms tired of dealing with North Point's declining service. Even a few of North Point's current clients, asking if I could take a look at problems their official support couldn't solve. Each call was validation. These people knew my reputation and had heard stories about systems that ran flawlessly for years without intervention. They'd experienced the difference between someone who understood technology and someone who just managed it. I was selective. Only took clients who were willing to commit long-term. People who understood that good work took time and cost money. No more 90-hour weeks fixing other people's shortcuts. No more emergency calls at 3 a.m. because someone had ignored my recommendations and tried to save money with inferior solutions. Within a month, I had 12 contracts. More revenue than my old salary, working from home, setting my own hours. But the best part was watching North Point's stock price. It had dropped 8% since I was fired. The market was starting to notice that something was wrong with their operations. Marla's quarterly report was due in 6 weeks. That's when things would get really interesting. I was debugging a client's database architecture when my secure phone rang. Only 3 people had that number: my lawyer, my accountant, and my doctor. The caller ID showed a government number I didn't recognize. Mr. Drexler? This is Kevin Walsh from the Securities Commission. We're investigating some irregularities in North Point Industries' quarterly filings. Would you be available for an interview? My blood went cold, then hot, then cold again. The SEC didn't call unless they had serious concerns. This wasn't a routine audit. What kind of irregularities? Reporting discrepancies related to operational capacity and infrastructure stability. Your name came up in several internal emails we subpoenaed. I'd never talked to any regulators. Never leaked anything. But apparently, other people had. Probably former clients whose systems had failed under Orvin's management. People who'd been promised capabilities that didn't exist. I can make time, I said. When? Tomorrow morning, if possible. This is time sensitive. After I hung up, I opened my files on Northpoint's infrastructure. Every system diagram, every capacity report, every performance metric from my 20 years there. If they wanted to know what Northpoint could actually deliver versus what they claimed in their investor reports, I had the receipts. All of them. The Securities Commission interview lasted 4 hours in a sterile conference room downtown. 2 investigators, a stenographer, and enough documents to fill a small library. They asked about system capabilities, infrastructure limits, and whether the performance numbers in Northpoint's reports matched reality. I told them the truth. Everything I'd built, everything I'd documented, everything Marla claimed the company could handle. The investigators took notes while I explained how their current infrastructure was hanging by threads. According to these quarterly reports, the lead investigator said, sliding a document across the table, Northpoint claims 99.9% uptime and the capacity to handle 5 times their current client load. I studied the numbers. That's impossible with their current hardware. The redundancy systems they're claiming don't exist. The load balancing capabilities they're advertising would require infrastructure they don't own. How certain are you of this? I designed every piece of that infrastructure. I know exactly what it can and can't do. The investigator made more notes. In your professional opinion, are they misrepresenting their operational capabilities to investors? I looked him straight in the eye. Yes, they're selling promises they can't keep, using systems they don't understand, managed by people who don't know what they're doing. He closed his notebook. Thank you, Mr. Drexler. This has been very helpful. As I walked out, I felt Augustus's presence. Justice was patient, but it was coming. That night, Dorian called with news that made my scotch taste sweeter. 3 more of Northpoint's clients just signed with my services. They're all asking for you specifically. The dominoes were falling faster now. Each client that left Northpoint was a piece of revenue Marla couldn't replace. Each failed system was proof that Orvin couldn't do my job. Each day that passed was another day closer to her quarterly report, where she'd have to explain why everything was falling apart. There's something else, Dorian continued. Marla called me personally today, offered to double our contract rates if we'd stop recommending you to their clients. I almost laughed. She was trying to buy back loyalty she'd thrown away. What did you tell her? I told her loyalty isn't for sale, but competence is, and they fired theirs. The irony was perfect. Marla thought she could replace relationships with money. She was about to learn that some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt with cash. Trust took years to build and seconds to destroy. She'd destroyed 2 decades of goodwill with a single email. She also asked if I knew where you were consulting now, Dorian added. Seems she's been trying to track your client list. That was interesting. If Marla was investigating my activities, she was more desperate than I'd thought, which meant the damage was spreading faster than even I had anticipated. Orvin called again the next week. This time he was sober, which somehow made it worse. Desperation without the excuse of alcohol. Caius, I need help. The backup system crashed, and I can't restore the client data. Marla's threatening to fire me if I don't fix it by morning. The backup system I designed with triple redundancy and automated recovery protocols. The one that had never failed in 8 years of operation. It was more reliable than the main systems, built to survive everything from power outages to natural disasters. What did you do to it? I asked. I tried to update the configuration. Just minor changes to improve efficiency. But now nothing works. He'd broken the one system that was supposed to prevent disasters. The one system that kept their clients' data safe when everything else failed. The irony was beautiful and terrible. I can't help you, Orvin. That's your job now. But I could help myself. I called 3 of Northpoint's biggest clients and offered emergency data recovery services. Professional, legitimate, and completely legal. I had backups of the backup procedures, documentation I'd created for my own reference years ago. They all said yes without hesitation. By morning, I'd recovered their data using knowledge that existed nowhere in Northpoint's systems. The clients were so impressed, they offered me long-term contracts on the spot. Orvin got fired that afternoon. Marla had run out of scapegoats. The SEC investigation went public the following Tuesday. Northpoint Industries under investigation for misrepresenting operational capabilities. The headline ran on every financial news site from Bloomberg to the local business journal. The stock dropped 22% in one day. By Thursday, it was down 35%. Investors were demanding answers. The board called an emergency meeting, and Marla was scrambling to explain how a company that claimed industry-leading infrastructure was falling apart in real time. I watched the news coverage from my new home office, surrounded by contracts from former Northpoint clients. 17 active projects, each one a piece of revenue that had once flowed to Marla's bottom line. The reporter mentioned significant operational failures and questions about technical leadership. They showed footage of Marla dodging questions outside the corporate headquarters, her sharp suit wrinkled, her confident smile replaced by the hunted look of someone who knew the walls were closing in. She looked smaller on camera, trapped, desperate, like a chess player who'd just realized that what looked like winning moves had actually been setting up their own checkmate. My phone rang. Celine Corwin, the HR director who'd handed me that insulting severance package 3 weeks ago. I let it ring. Some conversations weren't worth having yet. But soon. Celine tried 3 more times before I finally answered. When I did, her voice was different. Softer. Scared. The corporate authority was gone, replaced by the desperation of someone whose career was tied to a sinking ship. Caius, I know you're angry, but we need to talk about what's best for everyone. Everyone. I said. You mean Marla? There was a pause. The company's in trouble. Real trouble. The SEC investigation, the client losses, the system failures. The board is asking hard questions. I waited. Let her fill the silence with increasingly desperate offers. I have information you might find interesting. Internal emails. Board communications. Things that might help your situation. She was offering to flip. Jump ship before it sank completely. Rats and sinking ships, as Augustus used to say. What kind of information? Emails from Marla discussing your termination. How she planned it while you were at the funeral. How she called it perfect timing to get rid of an expensive employee. My jaw clenched. Perfect timing. She'd calculated my grief as a business opportunity, scheduled my professional execution to coincide with my personal loss. Send me everything, I said, but I want originals. And I want them tonight. Some betrayals deserve to be repaid in full. The emails arrived at midnight, delivered to a secure server I'd set up for client communications. Celine had sent everything. Marla's communications with the board, her plans to restructure the department by eliminating legacy employees and their outdated perspectives, her correspondence with Orvin about taking over my role, including promises of rapid promotion if he could modernize our approaches and improve team efficiency. But the worst was an email to the board dated the day before my father's funeral. Drexler will be out for bereavement this week. Perfect opportunity to implement the transition without disruption. Recommend immediate termination upon his return. She'd planned it. While I was flying home to bury my father, while I was choosing flowers for his casket and writing his eulogy, she was scheduling meetings to bury my career. The calculation was breathtaking. Use my grief as cover for corporate restructuring. I forwarded every email to my lawyer and my accountant. Then I did something that would have made Augustus proud. I started documenting everything for a wrongful termination lawsuit that would make Marla's SEC problems look like a parking ticket. 3 days later, Marla showed up at my apartment. I watched her through the peephole, pacing on my doorstep like a caged animal. Her usual confidence was gone, replaced by the nervous energy of someone whose world was collapsing. When I opened the door, she looked exhausted. Dark circles under her eyes, hair slightly disheveled, the kind of appearance that spoke of sleepless nights and emergency board meetings. We need to talk, she said. I let her in, but didn't offer her a seat. She stood in my living room, surrounded by the client contracts spread across my coffee table. Her eyes scanned the documents like she was trying to count how much revenue had walked away from her company. The board wants you back, she said without preamble. Full reinstatement. Raise. Stock options. Whatever it takes. I picked up one of my consulting contracts and pretended to read it. The silence stretched between us like a chasm. Interesting timing. Caius, I know you're angry, but we can fix this. Make it right. I looked up at her. You fired me at my father's funeral because it was convenient. You called it perfect timing in an email to the board. Her face went white. She knew I had the evidence. Knew that her carefully crafted corporate persona was about to be exposed for what it really was. That was poor judgment. That was calculated cruelty. I set down the contract. You wanted me gone. Congratulations. I'm gone. But I took my knowledge with me. And my relationships. And my reputation. She tried bargaining for another 20 minutes. Offered to fire Orvin publicly. To make him the scapegoat for all the failures. Promised me a VP title with my own budget and hiring authority. I even suggested I could handpick my replacement when I retired, ensuring a smooth succession this time. But we both knew it was too late. The damage was done, and it was spreading like poison through their entire operation. Each day brought new system failures, new client complaints, new evidence that they destroyed something irreplaceable. You don't understand, she finally said, desperation creeping into her voice like water through a cracked foundation. Without you, the company won't survive the SEC investigation. The board is asking questions I can't answer about capabilities we claim to have. I walked to the window and looked out at the city. Down there, in office buildings and server rooms across the metropolitan area, systems I designed were running smoothly under new management. Clients I'd rescued from Northpoint's incompetence were experiencing the reliability they'd been promised but never received. You should have thought about that before you decided my father's death was a business opportunity. She left without another word. That evening, Dorian called with the final piece of the puzzle. Northpoint just lost their 3 biggest accounts. All came to us, all asking for you by name. The foundation was cracking. Soon, the whole structure would collapse. The SEC released their preliminary findings on a Friday afternoon, the kind of news dump designed to minimize media attention. But the financial world noticed immediately. Northpoint had systematically overstated their technical capabilities for 2 years. They'd promised infrastructure performance they couldn't deliver, claimed system redundancies that didn't exist, and reported capacity numbers that were mathematically impossible given their actual hardware. The documentation I'd provided painted a clear picture. A company selling capabilities they'd never possessed, managed by people who didn't understand what they were selling. The stock dropped to half its original value in after-hours trading. By Monday morning, the board had called another emergency meeting. I was having coffee with my 15th new client when Celine called one last time. Her voice was hollow, defeated. The board voted no confidence in Marla this morning. She's been terminated, effective immediately. I set down my coffee cup. And they want to offer you her position. Coup. Full authority to rebuild the technical division. The irony was perfect. They'd fired me for going to a funeral, and now they wanted me to take the job of the person who'd fired me. They wanted me to save the company that had tried to destroy me. Tell the board I appreciate the offer, I said. But I'm not interested in running a sinking ship. The silence stretched between us. Caius, the company won't survive without you. That's not my problem anymore. I visited Augustus's grave one final time before the news broke. The autumn leaves were falling, covering the grass around his headstone in gold and red. The oak tree above had grown taller since I was a child, its branches now reaching toward the sky like arms raised in celebration. It's done, Dad, I said, kneeling beside the granite marker. Marla's gone. The company's finished. Everyone who stood by and watched while they humiliated us, they're all going down with the ship. The wind was cold, carrying the smell of winter and the promise of new seasons ahead. In the distance, I could hear the sound of traffic, people going about their lives, building and creating and working towards something better. You always said some people mistake kindness for weakness. They thought I was just a quiet employee they could throw away. They were wrong. I stood up and brushed the dirt from my knees. They fired me while I buried you. Now I've buried them all. Walking back to my car, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Peace. Not the peace of revenge, but the deeper satisfaction of seeing justice done through patience and preparation. Augustus would have been proud. His son had learned the lesson well. Northpoint Industries filed for bankruptcy 3 weeks later. The SEC investigation had found systematic fraud in their operational reporting, painting a picture of a company that had built its entire business model on capabilities that existed only on paper. Marla was facing federal charges for securities fraud. Orvin was working at a computer repair shop in the suburbs, his reputation destroyed and his LinkedIn profile scrubbed of any mention of his brief tenure at Northpoint. Most of their employees found new jobs, but the company itself was finished. Liquidated. Gone. I was in my new office, in a building I'd bought with consulting revenue, when the final news broke. The office had windows on 3 sides and a view of the river where Augustus and I used to fish on Sunday mornings. It felt like coming full circle. Dorian walked in with a bottle of champagne and 2 glasses. Thought you'd want to toast the end of an era. We poured the drinks and stood by the window, looking out over the city where North Point's headquarters used to cast.